Welcome back to another blind amp shootout, and this time we're comparing both amp sims and my real tube amp here. Now the first one of these I compared 6 different amp sims ranging from premium neural DSP to audio assault, which are less expensive but still current, and then the old free Pauline ones. Today I wanted to shoot out a couple of sims against a real tube amp through the same IRs and just see what kind of results we get. The tube amp I have here is the Laney Ironheart Studio. This is the little brother of the larger 100 watt and I believe 50 watt Ironheart models that were released a while ago. It's quite a versatile amp, and I think when it came out new it was somewhere around $700, so this isn't the most high-end of all tube amps by any stretch, but it's not a cheap tube amp or a micro tube amp either. Now of course this isn't going to sound exactly the same as a 100 watt tube amp would, that's a given, but it is all tube. The preamp tubes are 12AX7s and the power amp tubes I believe are EL34s, so it is all tube from a respected brand, and it should serve us well enough for our purposes today. So I'm running my guitar into my DI box, and that's splitting it between the computer and the amp, going through both at the same time. That allows me to play the same DI through all the amp sims as well as the tube amp. It's the exact same take, so there's no differences there in performance. So I wanted to do this to address a few of the comments on the first video. One guy mentioned harmonics, which I'm going to test. I want to see how a high gain pinch harmonic reacts differently between tube and simulation and between different simulations. And I wanted to, of course, test the difference between tube and simulation itself. I also wanted to do a clean test and then a sort of edge of breakup crunch tone test, as well as high gain. So we sort of cover all the bases there. So my tube amp is set up how I like it, and I'm going to match the sims to that. This amp does benefit from a boost, so I'm using my cheap Golden Horse Klon style pedal. That is also going before the signal splits off, so both the DIs and the tube amp are going to have the exact same boost on them. I'm going to try to process them as little as possible and as similarly as possible, so they will all be run through the same noise gate and IR. I'm not going to do any sort of EQing or filtering on the IRs. I've got it as clean as possible. So I'm going to have 3 amp sims, and you'll find out what they are at the end. Again, from different price brackets like before, plus this tube amp. So we'll have 4 different ones. I'm going to keep the letters consistent between all the demos. So A will be A, but I'm going to just put them in a random order, and you'll see if you can figure out which one is the tube amp, or at least which one you like best. So let's play some guitar, and I'll see you on the other end. All right, so I've just spent the last hour or so trying to match all these amps together, and it's a bit of a tricky process. It just involves a lot of going back and forth, listening to certain segments, trying to figure out, does it need more gain, less gain, more mids? And the EQ stacks on all amps are different, and that goes doubly for this particular amp. And I think that's the main thing I've learned in this go through, is not that there's a magical tube character, though there is a certain character that I really like about this Laney, but the main thing is that EQ-wise, not only do the EQ knobs on the amp, which I have set fairly neutral, but they're not that extreme. Compared to most amp sims, if you crank the treble all the way, it doesn't do that much. It feels maybe like 3 to 6 dB, not 12 or something. So the tone stack on it is more mild, and it's very mid-range heavy and pretty dark. Even if I crank the treble and do everything I can, this thing is pretty dark, and I think that's why I've never really loved it for modern metal stuff. I think it's a good classic rock or blues amp, which I don't do so much of. I mean, sure, you could probably pull off a maiden tone, no problem. If you're going for a little more old school metal, it works. And it can do modern metal. It kind of needs some help. It needs some post EQ, maybe some pre EQ, a boost. It gets fairly high gain, but as I said, I'm running my clon before it, my fake clon. I don't have that kind of money. Before it, to give it some extra edge and just bump up the input gain. It does have this pre-boost knob, but I do like the tone roll-off, the low-end roll-off of a clon-style pedal or a tube screamer. So dialing in the amp sims to sound like this amp is a bit tricky, I guess, and on a lot of them, I was like turning the presence almost all the way down, or rolling way back on the presence, sometimes the treble too, bumping the mids way up, and depending on the amp, some of them just didn't they didn't match as well as I wanted, but I didn't want to break out another EQ and really try to go into doctoring the tone too much. I just want to see sort of how close they can get out of the box. So let's reveal what the amps are. And before I do that, I want you to go down in the comments and tell me which one you think is the tube amp. If you can tell, if you have a guess. And also, which one did you like best? Maybe it's the tube amp, and maybe not. I already have a prediction that most of your guesses for which one is the tube amp will be wrong. Without further ado, the results. A is the AHM 5050 from Audio Assault. B is the Laney IRT Studio tube amp. C is Archetype Gojira from Neural DSP. And D is the Legion from Poolin. Now the Legion did very well. I think in my last test, a lot of people told me they liked that the best. I thought, it was impressive that it holds up 10 years later. And a lot of people really like that better than any of the others even, which surprised some people because I think most people would assume that, well, 10 years later, we've got to have better amp sims. And I'm not sure about that. Its GUI is outdated, but that would be an easy enough fix if they want to do an update at one point. I would like that. I think the hardest one to dial in this time was Archetype Gojira, and it's a great sounding plugin, and it has very mix ready tones right out of the box, but in that sense, it was almost, something about it was kind of too polished in the mid range to really keep up with this. If I boosted the mids all the way, it still wasn't quite right, and some of that depends on the frequency of the actual mid character too. It also has a lot of high-end brightness and presence that I completely dumped all the presence. I turned the knob all the way down, I rolled back the treble, and I bumped the mids way up. On all of these amp sims, I turned the bass way down, and the depth or resonance, I turned all that way down, and turned up the mids and turned the treble and the presence way down. But I think in terms of EQ matching, the Legion was the closest, and then the AHM 5050, and then Archetype Gojira was last as far as sounding like this amp. But this isn't my favorite amp, and that's one reason that I don't use it that much, and I've always kind of struggled to get what I want out of it. And I suppose this further highlights that. I used to think maybe it was my speakers, even though I've recorded it direct in many times too. I don't dislike the amp, mind you, and I think it has a good distortion quality, and it's got some cool features. I like how easy it is to record, though nothing beats a plugin. But I think for me, I will save this maybe as I think it would be more useful if I want something different than a modern metal tone, which I do a lot, and I have a number of plugins that do that really well. It's almost hard to pick out which of them I want to use because they all do it really well. But I don't have as many amp sims that do more vintage, really sort of mid-heavy. I've got, maybe the orange from Amplitude they gave out for free, but I don't really like it that much. So, maybe if I'm doing something a little more vintagey, I'll pull out this amp. But I want to hear your thoughts, what your take on it is. Everyone's going to be listening with different devices, so maybe you'll hear something that I don't. But anyways, let me know in the comments what you think about this, and don't forget to smash like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.